James Porter stood in court, his faded military jacket hanging loose on his worn frame. "You're facing 30 days in jail," the judge said coldly. James clenched his jaw. After fighting for his country, this is how they repaid him? But when he handed his attorney a stack of papers, the judge's face twisted in shock. What was in those papers would change everything. James Porter sat in the courtroom, his back straight despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His hands rested on his knees, weathered and scarred from years of hard service. His faded military jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, the patches on it barely holding together after decades of wear. The jacket had been with him through firefights, freezing nights, and desperate moments in the Middle East. Now it felt out of place in the sterile environment of the courtroom, but James wore it like armor. Across the room, Judge Martin Holloway sat on the elevated bench, peering down over his glasses with thinly veiled irritation. Holloway was known for his no-nonsense demeanor, his harsh sentences, and his utter lack of empathy. He adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Mr. Porter," Holloway began, his voice sharp and condescending, "you've been charged with trespassing on government property. Do you have anything to say before I proceed with sentencing?" James slowly stood up. His knees ached, but his posture was steady. His gaze met the judge's with unwavering calm. "With all due respect, Your Honor," James said, his voice low but clear, "I wasn't trespassing. I was standing outside a Veterans Affairs office, the same office that promised to help me after I served this country." Judge Holloway's brow furrowed. "And that justifies causing a public disturbance?" James's jaw tightened. "I was asking for my benefits I earned. They ignored me." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Porter, this court doesn't have time for complaints about bureaucratic inefficiency. The fact remains that you were asked to leave the premises and you refused. That constitutes trespassing." James's hands curled into fists at his sides. He forced himself to take a breath. "I served 3 tours overseas. I was injured in service. I filed for my disability benefits 2 years ago. 2 years, Your Honor. And I've gotten nothing but excuses." Holloway's expression didn't change. "That's not the court's concern." James felt heat rising in his chest. He stared at the judge, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Not the court's concern? I bled for this country. I lost friends for this country. And now you're telling me it's not the court's concern?" Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Control your tone, Mr. Porter." James straightened his back. "Or what? You'll throw me in jail for demanding the help I was promised?" The tension in the courtroom was palpable. A few murmurs echoed from the gallery. Judge Holloway's gavel struck down hard. "Enough!" James's attorney, Emily Clark, leaned toward him. "James, sit down." James stayed on his feet, his chest heaving. His knuckles were white from the pressure of his clenched fists. He was tired of being ignored, of being treated like a problem instead of a person. He had fought harder battles in the desert, but this, standing alone, fighting against a system designed to forget people like him, felt harder. The prosecutor, Michael Reeves, stood. He was young, sharp, and polished in a crisp navy blue suit. His smile was thin and calculated. "Your Honor," Reeves began, "Mr. Porter has a history of disturbances. He's been cited multiple times for loitering and resisting orders from law enforcement." James's head snapped toward the prosecutor. "Loitering? I was sleeping in front of the VA office because I had nowhere else to go." "Objection," Emily said, standing up. "That's irrelevant to the charge at hand." "Overruled," Holloway said. "Proceed." James's heart hammered painfully in his chest. "I didn't resist any orders," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the courtroom. "I asked for answers. I asked for help. And I was ignored." "Mr. Porter," Reeves said smoothly, "it's not the VA's responsibility to provide you with housing."
James's mouth curled into a bitter smile. No, but it was their responsibility to process my claim. My benefits were approved. I have the paperwork to prove it. Emily's head turned toward him sharply. You have the paperwork? James nodded slowly. All of it. Reeves smirked. If you have the paperwork, why didn't you present it before? James's eyes darkened. Because no one would listen. Judge Holloway tapped his gavel. Enough. We'll recess until tomorrow. Mr. Porter, I strongly advise you to reconsider your approach to this case. Losing your temper won't help your cause. James's hands curled into fists at his sides. His gaze burned into the judge's. With all due respect, Your Honor, if you had fought for this country the way I have, you'd understand why I'm angry. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. That's enough for today. James sat down, breathing heavily. Emily put a hand on his arm. James, she whispered, do you really have the paperwork? James nodded. It's in my old duffel bag. Emily's eyes sharpened. Bring it tomorrow. If you've got proof, this case isn't over. James's gaze hardened. This case was never about trespassing. It was about making them listen. He stood and walked toward the exit, his footsteps heavy against the marble floor. As he passed by the gallery, he could feel eyes on him, some sympathetic, others judging. A younger man in a Marine uniform stood and gave James a slight nod of respect. James's lips curled faintly upward. Outside the courthouse, James stood beneath the cold gray sky. The wind cut through his jacket, but he barely noticed. His mind was already on tomorrow. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be ignored. James sat back down, his body stiff from the tension coiled inside him. His breathing was shallow, and his hands trembled slightly as he unclenched his fists. The cold, clinical atmosphere of the courtroom pressed down on him. Polished wooden benches, the judge's elevated bench looming overhead, and the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. He hated it here. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt like one. Emily Clark, his public defender, slid into the chair next to him. She was young, mid-30s, maybe, with sharp brown eyes and a quiet intensity about her. Her suit was slightly wrinkled, and there were bags under her eyes, but her gaze was focused and unwavering. Emily had been assigned to James's case at the last minute, but she was already proving herself to be more invested than anyone James had dealt with before. I don't understand why they're pushing so hard on this, Emily whispered, leaning toward him. You weren't even violent. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. His skin felt clammy under the courtroom lights. Because they don't care. I'm just another forgotten vet. Emily's brow furrowed. But it's a minor trespassing charge. They're treating it like you burned down the building. James shook his head, a dark smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Because they can't afford to admit they screwed up. If they admit I had a reason to be there, they have to admit the whole damn system is broken. The prosecutor, Michael Reeves, stood and adjusted his tie. He had a sleek, controlled air about him, the kind of man who'd spent his life on the winning side. His navy blue suit was crisp, his golden cufflinks catching the light as he tugged at his sleeves. He walked toward the center of the room with the casual confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the case. Your Honor, Reeves began, his voice smooth and practiced. The state would like to present evidence that Mr. Porter has a pattern of disturbances. He's been cited multiple times for loitering and resisting orders from law enforcement. James's head snapped toward the prosecutor. His shoulders stiffened. I wasn't resisting anything, James said, his voice low but sharp. I was trying to explain that I've been waiting on my disability benefits for over 2 years. No one would listen. Reeves's smile didn't waver. Be that as it may, Mr. Porter has a documented history of conflicts with authority. Objection, Your Honor, Emily said, standing up. That's irrelevant to the charge at hand. Judge Holloway barely even glanced at her. Overruled, Proceed. James's hands curled into fists again. His throat tightened. He forced himself to breathe. Reeves stepped closer to the bench. Mr. Porter's behavior demonstrates a pattern of hostility toward government officials. Security officers at the VA building stated that he became verbally aggressive when asked to leave. James's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. You mean when I asked for answers and they ignored me? Reeves didn't even flinch. Mr. Porter's anger is understandable, but that doesn't justify breaking the law. James's jaw tightened. His shoulders were so tense they ached. He stared at the polished surface of the defense table, the reflections of the overhead lights blurring against the dark wood. His mind drifted back to the nights in the desert, to the deafening sound of gunfire and the crushing weight of body armor on his chest. He could almost feel the heat of the sun, the dry air burning his throat. He remembered the nights after his injury, lying in a hospital bed, barely able to move. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. His back would never fully heal, and the nerve damage in his leg meant he'd never run again. His discharge papers promised support, medical care, financial assistance. That had been 6 years ago. 6 years of fighting. Not on a battlefield, but in waiting rooms, through endless phone calls, filling out forms that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. 6 years of being told to be patient, while the medical bills piled up, while the nightmares didn't stop, while the weight of it all pressed down harder and harder. And now they were acting like he was the problem. James squeezed his eyes shut. The courtroom noise faded, replaced by the echo of distant explosions and the cries of wounded men. He saw their faces, the ones who didn't make it home. He had survived. But for what? To be treated like a criminal for asking for the help he was promised? Emily's voice cut through his thoughts. James. He opened his eyes. Emily's hand was resting on his arm. We need proof, she whispered. We need to show them you were owed those benefits. James's gaze sharpened. Slowly, his hand drifted toward the front of his jacket. I have it, he said. Emily blinked. What? James's lips curled into a faint smile. I kept the paperwork. Emily's eyes widened. You mean? James's smile faded. His gaze darkened. Because it didn't matter. No one was listening. Emily's hand tightened on his arm. They'll listen now. James's eyes lifted toward the judge. Holloway was flipping through some papers, already looking bored and ready to move on to the next case. Reeves sat down at the prosecution's table, smoothing his tie with a satisfied smile. They're not expecting me to fight back, James said. Emily's smile was cold. Then let's give them a surprise. James sat back, his gaze dark. His pulse steadied. He had fought tougher battles than this, but this one was personal. He glanced toward Reeves. The prosecutor was whispering something to his assistant, his mouth curling at the corner. James's eyes narrowed. They thought they had already won. Tomorrow, they'd learn how wrong they were. James Porter sat in the courtroom the next morning, his back straight and his gaze steady. His old military jacket was draped over his shoulders, the worn patches and faded colors speaking louder than any words could. The tension in the room was palpable. The air was thick with quiet anticipation as Judge Martin Holloway adjusted his glasses and shuffled a stack of papers on his desk. The polished mahogany bench reflected the overhead lights, casting a cold glow over the room. Emily Clark sat beside James, clutching a thick folder of documents in her hands. Her expression was sharp and focused, a stark contrast to the quiet nervousness James saw in her eyes the day before. Now, there was a quiet confidence beneath her composure. She knew they had the ammunition they needed. The bailiff stepped forward and took the folder from Emily's hands, carrying it to the judge's bench. Holloway accepted it with an expression of detached boredom, but when he opened the folder and began scanning the contents, the shift in his face was almost immediate. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed as they swept over the pages. His grip on the paper stiffened. Emily stood, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Your Honor, these are official records from the Department of Veterans Affairs," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "They confirm that Mr. Porter's disability benefits were approved over 2 years ago, but never processed due to a clerical error." James watched as Judge Holloway's mouth flattened into a hard line. His fingers traced the edge of the paper as he read the document more carefully. Emily continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Furthermore, the VA's own internal memos acknowledge that Mr. Porter contacted them multiple times over the last 2 years, seeking resolution." She glanced toward the prosecutor's table. "They failed to respond." The courtroom was deathly quiet. Even the low hum of fluorescent lights seemed to fade under the weight of Emily's words. Judge Holloway exhaled slowly, setting the papers down on his desk. His gaze shifted toward James. "Is this true?" James stood. His back was straight, his chin lifted. His voice was calm but steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I was ignored, until I started asking for answers in person." Holloway's eyes flashed with something, not quite guilt, but the sharp sting of realization. His gaze lingered on James for a long moment. James could feel every eye in the room on him, the veterans sitting in the back row, the reporters scribbling in their notepads, the clerk adjusting his glasses. Even the prosecutor, Michael Reeves, looked uncomfortable for the first time since the trial began. "This changes things," the judge muttered, mostly to himself. James's fists unclenched. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his chest seemed to lighten. Emily stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss the trespassing charges on the grounds that Mr. Porter's actions were justified in the pursuit of his legally entitled benefits." Reeves shot to his feet. "Objection!" "On what grounds?" Emily shot back. Reeves's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced toward the judge, searching for support. He found none. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Overruled." Reeves's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, even if the VA failed to respond, Mr. Porter's actions still qualify as trespassing." James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "So what was I supposed to do, counselor? Sit quietly while my medical bills piled up? While I got eviction notices? While I sat awake at night wondering if I'd even make it to the next morning?" Reeves's mouth twisted. "There are legal avenues." "I took the legal avenues," James said coldly. "They led nowhere." Reeves sat down, his mouth curling into a frustrated sneer. Judge Holloway tapped his pen on the desk. His eyes lifted toward James. "Mr. Porter," he said carefully, "I'm inclined to agree with Ms. Clark. Your actions were not criminal. They were a consequence of bureaucratic negligence." James's heart hammered in his chest. "And furthermore," the judge added, his gaze darkening, "I am issuing an order to the Department of Veterans Affairs to immediately process Mr. Porter's benefits." The quiet in the courtroom shattered into murmurs. Reporters exchanged hurried whispers. James could hear the scratching of pens against paper. James's chest swelled. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but the reality of it hit him harder than expected. "Effective immediately," Judge Holloway said. James felt Emily's hand on his arm. She squeezed gently. He sat down, breathing hard. Judge Holloway stood. "Court is adjourned." His gavel struck the bench. James sat still as the courtroom began to stir around him. Reporters gathered near the back. The veterans sitting in the gallery exchanged glances, nodding toward James with quiet respect. Reeves stood stiffly at the prosecution's table, his jaw clenched so tightly James thought he might break a tooth. He turned and walked out without a word. Emily sat down next to James, her eyes shining. "James." James exhaled. "It's over." Emily shook her head. "No, it's just beginning." James's gaze followed Reeves as he disappeared through the side door. "They're not going to make this easy. They'll find another way to bury this." Emily smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep digging it up." James smiled. "Damn right we will." He stood up slowly. His back ached, his leg throbbed, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. As he turned toward the gallery, he saw a young Marine standing near the back. The young man was in full uniform, standing at attention. His jaw was tight, his expression hard, but his eyes were bright with admiration. James walked toward him. The Marine lifted his hand in a crisp salute. James's throat tightened. Slowly, he lifted his own hand and returned the salute. "Sir," the Marine said, "you've given us all hope today." James smiled. Then it was worth the fight. Emily joined him as they stepped toward the exit. The cold air hit them as they stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The street was quiet, the gray sky heavy with the promise of rain. "So, what now?" Emily asked. James smiled faintly. "I think I've got some calls to make." "To who?" James's smile widened. "A few friends who've been waiting just as long as I have." Emily laughed softly. "You're going to war with the VA?" James's gaze darkened, but there was warmth beneath it. "Hell yes." They walked down the courthouse steps together. James's jacket billowed slightly in the wind. He was still tired, still battered, but he wasn't beaten. Not anymore. A week later, James Porter walked back into the courthouse. His old military jacket was pressed and clean, the patches carefully stitched back into place. His shoulders were straighter this time, his stride more sure. The weight he'd carried for years, the humiliation, the abandonment, the sense of betrayal, felt lighter. But it wasn't gone. Emily Clark walked beside him, clutching a file under her arm. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. She was calm, but James could see the quiet anticipation behind her eyes. Judge Holloway sat stiffly at the bench, his usual air of authority in place. But this time, there was something different in his expression. A flicker of humility, perhaps even regret, beneath his stoic mask. "Mr. Porter," the judge said, his voice more measured than usual, "this court has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented." James stood, his back straight. "The court finds that your actions were not criminal," Holloway continued, "but rather the direct result of bureaucratic negligence within the Department of Veterans Affairs." James's breath hitched. He knew what was coming next, but hearing it aloud still sent a wave of relief crashing through his chest. "The charges against you are hereby dismissed." James allowed himself a small smile. He exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. "And," Holloway continued, his gaze steady, "I am issuing an order to the Department of Veterans Affairs to immediately release your owed benefits, in full, with back pay and accrued interest." James's mouth fell open. He blinked, almost not believing it. Emily squeezed his arm, her smile widening. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. He stood up, an unusual gesture for a man so defined by his cold authority. Slowly, he stepped down from the bench and approached James. "On a personal note," Holloway said, his tone quieter now, "I misjudged you." James's gaze hardened. His hands curled at his sides. "I didn't fight for this country so people like you could brush me aside." Holloway's eyes darkened with understanding. "And that's why you deserve better." James studied him carefully. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Holloway grasped it firmly. The handshake was brief, but the weight of it lingered as Holloway stepped back toward the bench. James turned toward the gallery. And that's when he heard it. A single clap. It echoed through the room, loud and sharp. James's eyes scanned the gallery and saw a young Marine standing at attention. His dress uniform was crisp, his expression serious, but his eyes were bright with admiration. Then another clap, and another. Veterans scattered throughout the room stood up. Some were wearing faded jackets like James's. Others wore medals pinned to their lapels. Some were young, others old, but all of them were standing. James's chest tightened. He saw a woman in her 50s wearing a gold star pin, the symbol of a mother who had lost a son or daughter in combat. She wiped her eyes as she clapped. The clapping grew louder, more unified. Michael Reeves sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his jaw tight. His gaze flicked toward James with thinly veiled resentment, but James didn't care. Not anymore. James stepped toward the young Marine, who immediately straightened and raised his hand in a sharp salute. James's throat tightened as he raised his hand and returned the salute. His hand was steady, his arm strong. "Sir," the Marine said quietly, "you've inspired us all." James's voice was rough. "It's not about me. It's about fighting for what's right." Emily stepped up beside him as they walked toward the exit. Reporters shouted questions as they pushed through the crowd, but James ignored them. He wasn't interested in being a headline. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, the sky clear. James squinted as he stepped into the light. "So," Emily said as they descended the courthouse steps. "What now?" James chuckled softly. "I think I've got some calls to make." Emily raised an eyebrow. "To who?" James's smile widened. "A few friends who've been waiting for justice." Emily's eyes flashed with amusement. "You're going to war with the system?" James's smile darkened. "Damn right I am." They reached the bottom of the steps. James stopped and turned toward Emily.
"You know," James said, "if you're going to stick around for this fight, you might want to prepare yourself. They're not going to go down easy." Emily smiled. "Neither are we." James nodded. "Then let's get to work." As they walked down the street, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from an old friend, a fellow Marine. "Heard what happened. We've got your back." James's chest tightened. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. His hand brushed against the worn edges of the patches sewn onto the sleeve. He had fought for his country. He had nearly died for it. And now, finally, he was going to fight for the men and women who had been left behind, because this time the system wouldn't win, not if James had anything to say about it.